Does the Gospel of Matthew really allude to the entire story of the Old Testament in chronological order? Let's check it out on this episode of Masterpiece. Hey, welcome to Masterpiece Bible. My name is Chris, and I want to help you take your Bible study experience to the next level and discover just how beautiful and fascinating this book really is. If you're new here, thanks so much for stopping by, and of course, make sure you hit that subscribe button and activate the bell so you won't miss any of our upcoming exciting episodes. And if you find the video helpful, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share it with anyone you think might also benefit from it. Okay, so we are once again in the Gospel of Matthew, and what we're trying to show is that this Gospel chronologically alludes to the entire story of the Old Testament from creation all the way to the end of the Babylonian exile. So in our last episode, we already looked at the first part of the Gospel up to the Sermon on the Mount in chapters 5 to 7, and if you haven't seen that episode, I would really encourage you to go back and watch it first so you're all caught up. The link is in the description box below. All right, so last time we stopped with the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5 to 7, where Jesus is up on a mountain talking about the law and quoting from the Ten Commandments, which we said reminds us of Moses, who receives the law, including the Ten Commandments, on Mount Sinai. So moving on from there, what happens after the Sermon on the Mount? Well, in chapters 8 and 9, we basically have a bunch of miracles. Jesus heals people, he calms a storm, he raises the daughter of Jairus. And when you look at this part of the gospel, at first glance, there doesn't seem to be much of a connection to what happens to Israel after their experience at Sinai. But once you take a closer look, you notice, for example, that the very first story in Matthew 8 is about the healing of a leper. And that after that, there's an emphasis on Israel's lack of faith, which leads people to oppose Jesus, which is pretty similar to the time when Israel leaves Sinai in the book of Numbers. Because there we have Miriam, who is healed from leprosy, and we have stories about Israel's lack of faith that leads them to oppose Moses. In fact, it may not be accidental that there are exactly 10 miracles in Matthew 8 and 9 that happen as a result of people's faith and that stand in stark contrast to the 10 rebellions of Israel that are mentioned in Numbers 14:22. So that was Matthew 8 and 9. Then we get to Matthew 10. And in that chapter, Jesus sends out his 12 disciples, who are mentioned by name, which once again reminds us of the book of Numbers, where Moses sends out the 12 spies who are also mentioned by name. Which means we're now at the point where Israel is about to enter the land, and what happens at that point? You remember, Moses gives a big speech, which basically covers the entire book of Deuteronomy. So it's not surprising that here in Matthew 10, Jesus also gives a speech, and one of the things he emphasizes in that speech is that the disciples should not be afraid of the people of the land, which is what Joshua and Caleb tell the Israelites when the spies return in Numbers 14, and what Moses tells Israel in Deuteronomy 31, and what God tells Joshua in Joshua chapter 1. And that's not the only connection to the book of Joshua, because at the end of Matthew 10, Jesus makes a statement that whoever receives the disciples will be rewarded, which reminds us of the story of Rahab in Joshua 2, who received the spies and was rewarded. Now, if that's true, then it seems like at this point of the gospel, Jesus is transitioning from being like Moses to being like Joshua. And that seems to be further confirmed in Matthew 11, because in Matthew 11, John the Baptist reappears, about whom Jesus says that he was a prophet and that no one greater than him stood up, which is quite similar to the statement about Moses in Deuteronomy 34, that no prophet like him stood up. So just like Moses was succeeded by Joshua, so John the Baptist is succeeded by Jesus. And just like the book of Joshua emphasizes at the end that the Lord had given Israel rest, so Jesus offers to give people rest at the end of Matthew 11. Which brings us to Matthew 12. And Matthew 12 begins with a Sabbath story, which is quite fitting, of course, because Jesus just talked about giving people rest at the end of chapter 11. So here we have a Sabbath story, and in that story, Jesus begins talking about David. In verses 3 and 4, he specifically mentions the story in 1 Samuel 21, where David is fleeing from Saul, and he's hungry, and he eats of the showbread at the tabernacle, which at that time is located at a place called Nob. So before, we were in the time of Joshua, the time when Israel settled in the land. Now we are in the time of David, in the time of kingship. And the parallels continue because just like Saul wants to kill David, so the Pharisees want to kill Jesus, as we learn in verse 14. And then in verse 18, Matthew quotes Isaiah 42. Behold, my servant whom I have chosen, my beloved in whom my soul is well pleased. Which again reminds of David, whom God calls my servant, and whose name means beloved. So very clear allusions to David in this part of Matthew. Now who comes after David? Solomon, right? The son of David, which is precisely what Jesus is called in Matthew 12:23. He's just healed a demon-possessed man, and then the people ask, this man cannot be the son of David, can he? And then in verse 42, Jesus mentions the queen of the south who came to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and he says, behold, something greater than Solomon is here. So towards the end of Matthew 12, we have these allusions to Solomon, which is interesting because in chapter 13, Jesus begins to speak in parables. And the Greek word for parable is parabole. And that word is used in the Greek translation of 1 Kings 4:32 for the proverbs that Solomon spoke. So here in chapter 13, Matthew presents Jesus as a teacher of wisdom like Solomon, which then prompts the people to ask at the end of the chapter, where did this man get this wisdom? Also, did you notice what Jesus talks about in his parables? Things of nature, like trees or birds or fish. In other words, the exact same topics that, according to 1 Kings 4:33, Solomon talked about in his Proverbs. So once you take a closer look, it's pretty clear that in this section, Matthew is strongly alluding to the time of Solomon. Okay, so we are now at the end of chapter 13, which means we're about halfway through the gospel, and so far the allusions are indeed leading us chronologically through the Old Testament. We started with allusions to the very beginning of Genesis, then we had allusions to the patriarchs, then we moved to the story of the Exodus and the wilderness experience, followed by allusions to the time of Joshua, and now we just saw the parallels to the time of David and Solomon. So far it's working out perfectly, and obviously the big question is it going to continue like that in the second half of the gospel? That's what we're going to look at in our next episode. But if you like, feel free to already take a look at the next few chapters on your own and see if you can find any allusions. And then let me know in the comments what you discovered. Would love to hear from you. As always, thanks for watching. Enjoy digging deeper into the Bible, and we'll see you next time. Ciao.